My brain's a busy traffic jam with honking thoughts and all. Some whisper soft like timid mice, some scream and bounce off walls. Did I pay that bill last Tuesday? Wait, do I own a cat? I swear I just walked into this room, but now why did I do that? The chores, they sing a mournful tune. The dishes stage a coup. Emails multiply like weeds. Texts demand review. I should be sleeping peacefully, but oh, my mind's a mess. Reciting things I said all day and questioning how I dress. Existential dread at midnight, a classic mental treat, along with deep debates on why my socks don't match my feet. I crave a breath, a break, a pause, a moment just to be. But life just laughs and shakes its head, says, nope, not yet, you see. The phone's possessed, it buzzes loud, the inbox overflows, the laundry pile just winked at me. How high? Nobody knows. I'd like to sit and sip my tea, just watch the flowers sway, but my own mind won't let me be. It chatters all the day. Did you lock that door? Oh, check again. Did you schedule that appointment? The bank account seems way too low. How do I deal with this disappointment? So here I stand, both here and there, a swirl of wants and needs, just searching for a quiet place between my scattered deeds. And then for some, they click ignore, because it's easier to turn away, to drown the noise, not feel at all, to push, hide, and hit delay. The thoughts creep in, they tap, they call, but they pretend not to hear. For listening to all these thoughts means facing them and fear. So they pack their day with tasks to do to keep their mind from breaking through. To think too much is to invite a flood of feelings, raw and bright. Regret, what ifs, the weight of care, the aching wish to just repair. It's easier to turn aside, to tuck the thoughts where they can hide. But silence hums beneath the din, and all that lives buried within. One day, perhaps, they'll let them speak, but not today. They feel too weak. So it's either chaos in this little head or ignorance is fine. But what I really wish for me is for a peace of mind. Isn't it true that at the deepest parts of all of us, what we really hope and what we really want for is this idea of a peace of mind? But if we're honest, it can often feel like peace is like just out of reach. That maybe it's accessible to somebody else, but for us, we just can't quite get there. Maybe we think like, okay, if once I get through this situation, or once I get through this season of my life, or once I get through this, then I will find some peace. But then something else pops up, another worry pops up, another situation, another season of life, and it starts to circle all over again. And we even go in even deeper and recognize that for a lot of us, our minds aren't just filled with like the chaos of the day, but with even bigger worries, bigger anxieties, things that are medical or financial or relational, or even spiritual complexities that take up massive size space in our thoughts and mind. So we're starting this series because here's the deal. We truly believe around here that we are created to experience God's peace of mind. And yes, even in the midst of all that surrounds us, even in the midst of all that comes our way, we really believe this isn't just some big pie in the sky idea that we say at church and it sounds nice, but it actually is possible. We really actually can have peace. And yet, if we're honest, we also know that it's just a little bit more complicated than we want it to be. Because it's not like we can just snap our fingers or say one Bible verse or say one quick one-time prayer or just have one different thought and then all of a sudden we have peace. And so here's an important spoiler alert about this series. We have not found the golden nugget that like eradicates all worry and anxiety and restlessness in our minds. We have not found the answer to the thing that wages wars in our minds. In no way would we ever promise that in just 3 short weeks, you'll have peace of mind, voila, like we've got it. However, we do wholeheartedly believe that God actually created our minds to experience this kind of peace. That he didn't design us to live in a constant state of stress and fear and worry. But finding that isn't automatic. If it was, we wouldn't have to be talking about it all the time because it would just be a quick, easy fix. But it does take some intentionality and some participation on our end as well. And so in this series, our hope is just that we would offer some tools, that we would offer some maybe new perspective, that we would offer some God-filled truths to our minds so that we can actually have hope in this area. that we can believe that peace of mind is something that God wants to bring us all into and that we actually all can experience. Because this is how we are intended to live. And so everything that we take in, every truth that we come in contact with, that just gives us one step closer to truly experiencing the peace and the life that Jesus came to usher in. I love, and you've probably heard this verse a ton of times, but I love in John, the book of John, he kind of writes down all of the things that Jesus said. And so Jesus is talking to a group of followers at one point in John 10. And he's talking about how, before him came kind of all this ideology of like what religious systems should be, put in place and kind of put a heavy burden on people. But Jesus says, that's not who I am. The thief comes, he says, only to steal and kill and destroy. But I have come that they may have life and that they may have it to the full. And this isn't just some like random verse he just pops in here. Jesus has spent time talking about how he is a good shepherd, that as a shepherd, he knows his sheep and he wants to offer a life and a place that is safe and that is secure and that is good for them. And then after this verse, after he says that I came to that they would find it to the full, he says, there are some sheep that kind of wander off and I am the shepherd that will go after them and bring them back into my fold. So for all of us, if we're placing our faith in Jesus, we can know that he says, man, what I want to offer you is a life that is full. And I think for all of us, what we would recognize as a full life is one that experiences peace, one that experiences rest, one that experiences just the idea that we aren't living in this constant state of chaos. But it's so easy to get tripped up on other things, isn't it? Right? When it comes to things like this, it's so easy, but we recognize what happens in our minds that when we focus on our worries, it actually does steal our joy. When we feel extreme stress, it does drain us of energy. How often does the battle in our mind impact the way that we show up, the way that we live out our day? I think all of us it'd be accurate to say all the time. Because our thoughts directly impact our emotions, whether or not we choose to feel them or not, and that in turn directly impacts how we show up in our lives, in our workplaces, in our families, in our relationships. And the enemy knows that if he can keep our minds at a state of unrest or a state of ignorance or a state of denial, that he can keep us from experiencing the full life that Jesus himself told us he came to give. And so we believe Jesus has something better. He didn't come just so that we could survive one day and then get to heaven, but he came so that we could flourish and thrive here with him on earth. And so I believe this means that he wants us to have minds that are at peace, hearts that are at rest, and a soul that is secure. And so in this series, we want to begin asking this question, okay, if that's the ideal, if that is what we believe that God offers us, how do we get there? What are certain steps? What are certain things that we can do to be able to experience this kind of peace? And as I've thought about this very gargantuan question, there's entire schools of thought that are dedicated just to this. But I've thought about this question. I think one of the most important things for us to understand, and I've been learning, is to understand how our brains work. Because I think too often, we just assume that maybe it's just like an easy fix that we haven't found the right answer to. And so then we find one thing and we try one thing and then we get discouraged and frustrated, so we give up. Or we just are like, man, this is just my lot in life. Like this is who I am. I worry, I'm anxious, I think about too many things, it's chaotic, or I just kind of shove it. Like this is who I am. And we don't actually put in the effort to understand and to try to see if there's something different. But our minds are centric to who we are. They're centric to how we show up in our lives. And we also know our minds can be so easily persuaded by the lies that surround us, that are threatening to take out the full life that Jesus offers. So I love also what Paul writes to the church in Corinth. He's writing a letter to them, kind of warning them against a bunch of things. But one of the things he warns them about is he says, hey, the battles that we fight are not like what the world fights. We don't actually use actual weapons. We are fighting and waging a war in our minds. And the thoughts that seem to creep in and to derail us from understanding who God is. And so he's got kind of an answer to this. He says, we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. So anything that would set us up against who we know God to be and what God came to offer, this is what we do. And so what do we do with that? He says, we take captive every thought and we make it obedient to Christ. That we recognize that our minds, that we have a responsibility and we're invited to say, man, every thought that comes into my mind, I can actually take captive and say, okay, I'm gonna hold this up in light. God, is this true? Is this what you want me to believe? Is this how you want me to internalize this? Lord, with your help, I wanna take captive every thought. And if it's not, I'm making it obedient to Christ, which is that Christ reigns over everything. And I think this verse is powerful because it reminds us that our peace, in some ways, is a little bit of a battle. That we are gonna have to constantly kind of wage war against this and say, take these thoughts captive, that they don't just run wild in our minds. Because here's the truth, that if we don't take control of our thoughts, we know this, right? Our thoughts will take control of us. And all of a sudden, we are just kind of going by the wayside of whatever thought decides to pop in, and we're not taking any ownership of is that a thought that I am going to allow to be in my brain? And so I think in this series, what I'd love to start out by doing is saying that I would love to be students of this, that we'd start to ask the questions, that we'd start to be students of our brains, we'd start to be students of our own minds, of kind of how we think and what is going on up there. One of our Heartland preschool directors is also a certified brain coach. And throughout her week, when she's not teaching preschool, she uses her gifts and talents to help kids and teens understand their brains. But the more I hear her teach about this and kind of explain how this works, I realize how helpful this information is for us, very much so for adults. Because I think there's so much going on in our brains, and I don't think most of us ever take the time to really understand and acknowledge what is actually happening. So when we take this idea of Paul, that what Paul writes about, and he says, take these thoughts captive and make them obedient to Christ, it is so important. And I think that in order to do our best to do that, it's really helpful to understand, okay, what is actually happening in our minds and the thoughts that are coming in. So I invited Erin to join us this morning, and I'm just gonna ask her a couple of questions so that we can unpack together a little bit more of what's going on in our brains. So would you help me welcome Erin Sadler?
Good morning, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Ashley.
Good morning. All right, we got to do this earlier, and I'm excited to do it again.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've spent a lot of time looking about you could geek out about this all day. I know you could.
I really get nerdy about it. Super exciting.
So my first question is just, why do you think it's important for us to understand how our brains work in our relationship with God, right? So that's interesting in and of itself, but how do you see, as you've kind of studied this, how do you see how that really impacts how we engage and how we allow the Holy Spirit and God to work in our lives?
I think, first of all, thinking of our brains as like these multifunctional, complex parts of our body that God creates for us so that we can experience the world around us and fully experience the world around us. And when you think about our brains, so here I'm going to nerd out, Ashley, we have about 6,000 thoughts a day that we think. And if you think about that as an inbox, like if you're thinking about email, that's 6,000 new messages coming in every day. And some of them are just like your inbox. You have the same message coming in every day. And some are new that are coming in. And your brain processes and filters and connects what needs to be connected, stores what needs to be stored, and then sometimes send some things to spam because we don't need all of those thoughts. And when we think all of those thoughts in our day, how that kind of happens in our brain is through neurons. So neurons we have 86 billion of them in our brains. We got a lot of them. And they look like trees. I think they look like trees. There's sort of a picture of them, and they have branches called dendrites. Then there's the cell body, more than you ever want to know, axon, and then there's an axon terminal. And why that's important to understand is when we choose our thoughts and we choose the thoughts that work for us, we can actually grow bigger, stronger branches at the top. Those dendrites can grow stronger, and that actually makes our synaptic connections go faster. So we can actually kind of do weightlifting for our brain. And if 86 billion neurons didn't immediately make you be like, wow, how? Here, I'll give you this fact. So you have 100 trillion synaptic connections in your brain. And just to put that into context, they think that there are 100 trillion stars in our galaxy. So God created our brain to have a galaxy's worth of stars in our brain making synaptic connections. And really, if you can Google it, but if you see these synaptic connections going on in the brain, your brain is lighting up. It looks like a fireworks show. So through your neurons they're talking to each other. They're passing this information, and this information looks like chemical and electrical signals, which actually creates our brains to light up, which is pretty cool. So when we think about how our brains work and that sort of our brain and our neurons talking to each other, we're gonna do a little experiment. You guys ready? Okay, so in just a second, I'm gonna tell you to tell your brain to wiggle your toe. Wiggle your toe. Okay, some of your neurons jumped the gun, and the minute I said, I'm gonna tell your brain just went ahead and did it and wiggled your toe. But what actually just happened was your neurons started in your brain and sent the impulse through all the neurons in your body down to your toes and wiggle your toes. And that happened pretty simultaneously with me saying it. It was so immediate. And that's one of the cool ways our brains, when we think about like thoughts coming in, everything is processing so quickly. When our neurons are talking to each other, it happens consciously, but it also happens in a default mode network. And that's kind of the background. So when we talk about how our brains work, we have all of our neurons connecting, but then we have this default mode network of neurons. And they're kind of like the background. They keep us going. So I often think when I'm driving, I work here, so when I'm driving to Heartland every morning, I am sort of driving, but I'm also having this whole maybe like a daydream conversation. Maybe I'm planning my day out. Maybe I'm thinking about what our family's gonna have for dinner. And I'm doing all that, and then all of a sudden I'm in the parking lot at work. And I didn't really think about how I got there. I just showed up. And thank gosh, we have a default mode network, because otherwise that could have been really my daydream would have taken me offline. But so our brains are constantly running this background information for us as well. And then, okay, so we have conscious thought, we have default mode network. Now I'm going to throw brain wavelengths are in there too. So, and I could literally talk about that for a whole nother hour. But that's kind of like if you're thinking about your brain shifting into different mental states, that's your brain wavelengths are constantly changing too. So we have all of that going on in our brains at the same time. And I think God's design, it is so complex what is going on in our brains, but it's also so simple. We walk around and you don't think about your brain wavelength. I don't think about my default mode network or how many neurons just connected to tell me to wiggle my toe. We just exist and are living. And all of the connections that we're making, we get a choice and how we want our brains to connect. And that's that neuroplasticity. The thoughts we think make the highways for our brains, for our neurons to travel down. And so if something isn't serving us, or we've done it one way for a certain amount of time, and then we switch to a different way, we can build a new superhighway a different way for our neurons to travel. One of the cool ways I think about this is gratitude. God calls us to be grateful and to practice gratitude. And one of the cool ways he designed our brains is you can't have a stress thought and a grateful thought happening at the same time. They run on different neural networks. So if you are feeling stressed and you choose to lean into gratitude, that actually sort of changes the network that's being used in your brain. And what it does is it releases serotonin, which is the neurotransmitter, the electrical signal or the chemical that's jumping between the two neurons. It'll release serotonin, which makes us feel happy, oxytocin, which makes us feel loved, and then dopamine, which is our reward neurotransmitter that's happening. And I think that's such a good design of how God calls us to be outward facing. We have to get the stimulation from our environment. We're giving and putting out constant information, but also God calls us to have that like rest and reset. And in our current world and how we live, there's so much stimulation. And if we're not carving out time to do things like practice gratitude and prayer, then we're not giving ourselves that time to like rest and reset. And then if you'll allow me, I really nerd out. So I'm gonna go one more nerd, and then I promise I'll let you ask another question. So one of the other cool things that our brain does is, I'll use gratitude or kindness as an example. So let's say I see two people, one person's the giver of the kindness, one person's the receiver of the kindness, and I'm the bystander. The person who does the act of kindness and the person who receives the kindness both have a chemical reaction in their brains. They'll carve a neural network that lights up, and again, it's that serotonin, happiness, dopamine, that reward, and that oxytocin, which makes you feel loved. Those two people experience that. Me as the bystander, just observing it, I had the same chemical reaction happen in my brain. So we helped, when God calls us to be connected, he's connected our brains as well. My brain lights up with those same helpful chemicals to balance my brain when I just observe kindness. So we are all connected, and we can light each other's brains up just by when we are kind to each other. So it's just kind of cool when you really think about how God wired our brains to be, what he calls us to be and do is already woven into our brains.
I love that. Yeah. It's just such a cool, and when you think through also in scripture, it's like, pursue gratitude and, your kindness and compassion, that it truly isn't just like, that's a good idea, but it actually is, God has hardwired us to that, to be good for us.
Yeah.
Okay, so talk a little bit about this. As we're talking about peace of mind, obviously there's in a humanity, there are lots of neurodivergencies. So there's lots of different things that are at play in our brain. Some of it is biological, some of it is psychological, with whether experiencing trauma or, hard events in our lives that our brains are having to process. But it kind of in addition to that, there's this kind of chaos that happens in our brains that kind of try to rob us of the peace. So what happens when that is actually happening? Like that is actually like something that's going on within our minds and our brains that we can kind of understand a little bit of like popping the hood to what's happening under there.
Yeah, I think a good way to think about it is, while I would love for us to all live in a peaceful outer state our whole lives, that's actually not how our brains were created. God created our brains to actually thrive and make new neural connections when we feel stress and struggle. So the outer world is not always going to be peaceful. And through those struggles, when we figure out new solutions to our problems, when we get knocked down but we get up again, what's actually happening in your brain is making new neural connections, new pathways to help you solve that problem for next time. Your brain's forward thinking and helping you to be able to solve that. Really, struggles are kind of like weightlifting for your neurons. It's making you stronger for the next time you have a struggle. But I will say, getting in a stressful state for an elongated period of time doesn't build resilience, it builds burnout. So we have to have the balance between, we learned something, but also we're taking the restful time as well. And we're finding a way to carve into that time where we can have downtime and sort of reflect on how we think about what we're thinking about. So I'll tell you a little bit about what's happening in your brain when you are feeling stressed or have been under stressors for a while. So you have the first thing is you're going to have a feeling. That feeling's going to register in your amygdala. So your amygdala, whenever you have a really big feeling, you can just think something the size of an almond is where it's registering in your brain. So you can think, oh, great, this is all happening, and it's processing through something the size of an almond. So it registers in your brain. You have a big feeling. That processing in your amygdala says like, emergency, emergency. And when it's saying emergency and it's sending that fight or flight response to you, what's happening is then your prefrontal cortex, which is your thinking, logical, managing your emotion portion of your brain that controls that, actually quiets down a little bit and you don't have full access to it. So it does that because your amygdala's job is to keep you safe. And if there really truly were an emergency, you would want your amygdala to take over and not have a whole logical thought about why you should get away from the bear. You just need to get away from the bear. So when your amygdala's in overload mode and you're constantly under stress, what's happening is you're kind of shortening the fuse you have for your emotional responses. And over time, not having access to logical thinking skills in your prefrontal cortex and having your amygdala be online all the time, it puts an overdue burden on the rest of your brain and body. And I'm just going to read a couple of things that happen. First of all, your hormones can get out of whack. Just like I talked about the positive neurotransmitters that happen, we all have cortisol in our bodies, and cortisol is our stress hormone. We live with it, and it doesn't really it's it's pretty neutral until we have an overabundance of it. And when we have an overabundance of cortisol streaming through our system all the time, it does things like cause chronic inflammation. It raises our heart rates. It causes us, that default mode network that got me to work so nicely, it causes it to start to go a little wacky, and we'll start having ruminative thoughts. And I'll wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and think, why did I say that to my third grade crush? That was really, and it just sends you completely offline with your thoughts. And you start having these sort of thoughts that in your belief system and yourself that don't feel right or feel off or feel negative all the time. And then some other things that happen is another part of God's design, you have a nervous system and you have the parasympathetic side and the sympathetic side. The parasympathetic is your rest and digest, and your sympathetic is the one that's trying to keep you alive and do all the things. And when we increase our sympathetic, that increases blood flow, it increases our heart rate, it kind of can mess with your digestive tract a little bit. So if we constantly have that one activated and we never get to the rest and digest, we quickly become out of balance in our bodies as well. And then it fuels that. And then we just get sort of in a hamster wheel of the self-doubt and the stress, and we don't really know how to get ourselves out because we've become out of balance. But the good news is our brains are resilient. And if we can start to carve some new neural pathways, we can start to create that neuroplasticity and that change to help us get that balance back in our lives.
I love this idea because I think we talked a little bit about, I think about it as ruts, but you talk about it as neural pathways. But we've kind of thought the same thing over and over and over again. And so it's just our default mode. It's like, oh, this happens. And I think a lot of times, unfortunately, negative thoughts, go in this direction. And so I think this is the idea of taking those thoughts captive of like, actually, is this true? Is this helping me? Is this serving me? Is this actually what God wants for me? And kind of picking our thought up and being like, nope, we're going to go on this pathway. But the hard part is right away, that pathway isn't, it's not actually like going to be easier.
Yeah.
But it's through time. So I think sometimes we get discouraged because we're like, I captured my thought and I tried the nice thing and it's way easier for me just to land over here. But it's over time trying to carve new pathways that we, in some ways, force our minds and our brains to focus on until that becomes an easier path.
Yeah. When I talk to kids, I sort of say, when you're trying to do something new and you're carving a new neural pathway, it's kind of like you're in a covered wagon going over a bumpy road. You're kind of on the Oregon Trail heading that way, and it feels really uncomfortable at first because that's not what your brain's used to. And your brain's job is to be efficient. So if you have done something the same way over and over and over again, even if it's not serving you, your brain's inclination is to just get on the superhighway and take that path, is because it's the fastest route from A to B. So carving that new pathway takes some time, but then once you've carved it and you've practiced that over and over and over again, that becomes the new superhighway, which is kind of cool.
Yeah. You talked about like a little about the inbox, is that we have all these emails that come in, and some of them we signed up for years ago, and we're like, we don't need that anymore. But we just let it kind of live in the kind of constant state of our mind. And sometimes it's taking the intentionality to be like, I don't need that. And so Lord, would you help me in kind of sending this to spam?
Yeah, Lord, please help me move it to the spam box. I like that.
Okay, so the other option is that, for some people, they're like, this is why I just don't think about anything. I would prefer to turn my brain off and just like go on default mode, and I just kind of any emotion or negative thing I feel, I just like set over here, and that is how I find peace of mind. And that sounds chaos of thinking all of those thoughts. So I've just decided I don't want to think about anything. So talk a little bit about what that does to our brains.
Yeah. Well, if any of you have heard me speak before, I call that ostriching. That's putting your head in the sand. And sometimes we do it and we're very conscious, like, I don't want to think about that today. And sometimes we don't do it consciously, especially if we've had chronic stress, traumatic stress. Then that can be something that has just become part of our neural network and who we are. And one of the things I will say about that is that distraction in and of itself is not a bad thing in small doses. So, for example, if my amygdala is kind of going offline because I feel very angry towards somebody, I may sit down on my couch and say, I'm going to read my book for 10 minutes to help calm that or to work through that emotion so that I don't go yell at that person. That's a time when distraction can be helpful. What is not helpful is when we're constantly using distraction and then we're not circling back to have those conversations or to reflect and sort of analyze our thoughts. And then we just let our lives continue to go on that stressful plane. And here's the truth. That default mode network I talked about earlier, it's always keeping the score. Your brain is constantly surveying to keep you safe. It's looking for dangers out there. So it is scoring when you have those stressors and you're just choosing not to look at them. I often use the analogy of like, you have a really messy closet and you keep shoving things in there and then you're holding the door closed and maybe you have people over your house and you're like, oh gosh, please nobody even like walk by that door because it could spring open at any moment. And so you're so busy trying to keep the doors of that closet closed, like, you know, you're having the conversation, you're sort of leaned against the door and you're like, oh yeah, everything's great. But what's happening is you are expending all your mental energy with holding whatever is in that closet so the door doesn't swing open and you don't feel embarrassed when it all spills out. And you're not spending any mental energy in actually finding peace of mind. You're not spending any energy in finding the balance for your brain. You are spending all your energy on trying to keep that stress behind the wall. And what happens is you start to disconnect from yourself. When you're not acknowledging any of your stressors or your emotions or things that are building up, you start to create a wall. And that wall is between you. It can often be between those you love. It can be for the things that you used to find really enjoyable. You start to say, it's not as fun as it used to be, or I used to find joy in that, but I don't anymore. And I think the biggest thing and the most harmful thing is it can build a dam between you and your relationship with God. You're holding back so much that you're not letting anything through. So there's not that communication between you and God. And I think that can be the most harmful thing when we just ignore and we don't process. Mm-hmm. And I know that opening that closet door is going to take a little bit of mess and it's probably going to fall out on my head, but I think sorting through it in the long run is probably something. It might take the help of a professional to help sort through all that, but I think it's an important thing to do.
Yeah. I was talking to a good friend of mine. He is 10 months sober, and he just as he's reflected on his sobriety journey, I think he found himself in a place that he's like, I knew all the things, and yet I still, was in denial about how much I depended on alcohol. And he said, in my head, I had surrendered everything. Like I knew I was surrendered, but there was so much that I was keeping at bay, so much I didn't want to deal with, so much that I was, just been taught like, nope, don't have emotion. You just stick it out. You go through the motions. I don't need anybody's help. That it all came kind of crumbling out. And he said, I realized that there was so much unexamined in my life, and you can't surrender what you don't examine. But so much of my life was just kept unexamined because it was too painful, or it was awkward, or I didn't want to. And I was kind of taught like, nope, you don't deal with emotion. And then it all came crumbling out. And I thought, what a powerful statement that you can't surrender what you don't examine. And we get it. The examining part can be, scary, excruciating. Like there's so many things. And yet, that is where God says, I will meet you there, and there's healing on the other side. There is actually hope for this, but it's examining this, and it's not to embarrass us. It's not to cause fear, but it is to bring healing, and that's what he has found so much.
Yeah, and I have also found in the kids I've worked with, sometimes the anxiety about opening the closet door is sometimes greater than what actually lies beyond the closet door sometimes. If you will allow me one more really nerdy moment. I just wanted to show you guys over time, if you guys don't mind putting up the neuron. Yep, thank you. So in our brains, when we are exposing ourselves to chronic stress and we're not doing that balance, we're not finding that rest and renewal, what happens over time is you'll see on the right side, there's this giant, the neurons have their dendrites with all the branches. And on the left side, neurons exposed to chronic stress can't grow and actually shrink and weaken over time. So what happens in our brain is we don't have as many synaptic connections, and we can't make as many connections to solve our problems in our brain. So I think it's just really important to know that it does have an effect on our brain when we don't find that balance and that peace of mind in our lives.
Love it. All right, well, I know you're really passionate about tools, but we don't have time to do that. So we are bringing back the Heartland Bonus Content Podcast. And so this week, Erin's going to join us, and we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about this, as well as some great tools that you've seen and kind of helped with kids, but we can take as well.
Yeah, Ashley, when she asked me to come speak today, I'm like, I would love to. And then I went into my toolbox and she's like, no, just informative. And I was like, no, I gotta say, how do we do this? So anyway, so I was so glad she was like, we could do the bonus podcast. Don't worry, Erin. So I was like, great. So I will be on there with some tools and just little things you can do differently to help wire some new neural pathways. So anyway, thank you guys for having me.
Erin. All right, well, as we close today, I just want to leave myself with this reminder that Paul tells us to take our thoughts captive. And so that means that we don't just let fear and anxiety and worry and stress and chaos just run rampant, unbridled in our minds, that we begin to say, okay, I am going to take these thoughts and I want to surrender them to Christ. I want to put them under his light and allow him to speak into those. That we would start to be people that would say, okay, I want to start replacing these lies for truth. And that's how, one step at a time, we continue to win this battle for peace in our minds. Because peace doesn't just fall into our laps, right? If it did, that would be amazing. But I think actually this is what God invites us into, because then it's this relationship that he can say, I want to do this with you. This isn't a checklist. This is an invitation to a relational connection with the God who created our minds and our brains, for him to help us say, let me be in this with you to help bring peace of mind. So today I just want to leave you with what is one step that you can take in pursuing God's peace of mind in your heart. Maybe that next step is just pulling aside a trusted friend or somebody that you really respect in this area, and maybe getting honest about what's happening in your mind. Maybe you want to share the heaviness that you feel and let them help you sort that out. Maybe it's finally calling a therapist or a counselor, right? People whose life, their purpose in life is to help people get unstuck from unhealthy patterns and unstuck from trauma that has potential to wreak havoc on their lives. Maybe the next step is maybe saying, okay, I'm gonna really get focused on this prayer life, and not out of a ritualistic or legalistic. Maybe you grab a journal and you say, Lord, I want you to examine, help me, just what are the things that I'm holding back, and what words do you have to speak to me? That we would speak those words, maybe we'd write those words, and then we'd stick around long enough to hear God speak back to us. Maybe it means finally taking that medication that will help kind of balance out a chemical makeup in your brain. And we'd let that stigma of taking medication die, and that we would be able to experience a flourishing life so that we can have the mindset to use these kinds of tools. Maybe a next step is showing up at Regen on Monday nights here at Heartland and joining in with some amazing men and women who are on similar journeys and just dealing with past and struggles and habits, and they are finding freedom and community. Maybe it's joining a 12-step program and really getting honest about some things that are happening in your life. Maybe it's grabbing a devotional and saying, you know what, every morning I am starting out with filling my mind with truth, not with what's on my phone or what my brain just automatically goes to, but I am going to start creating new pathways in the morning. Or maybe there's another idea that's in your head, and that is what the Holy Spirit is impressing on you, and it's not on my list. And if that's it, do that. I don't know what the next step is for you, but I do know there is one. And that often it is a slow and yet steady path towards pursuing peace of mind that God has for us. So I know that we didn't answer hardly any questions today, other than hopefully pique your interest. And that's why we're going to continue in this series over the next 2 weeks as we really dive into what does it look like to find peace of mind. Let me pray for you as we go.